Welcome to my presentation on the Democratic Party and its rural constituents. The question we seek to answer in both this presentation and my research essay is why voters in poor rural areas are abandoning the Democratic Party in favor of politicians who only have the interests of big corporations on their minds. My answer to this question and my thesis is that many poor working class people in rural America do not trust the Democratic Party or the United States government to protect them and their interests. This stems from policy breakdowns, a lack of adequate jobs and education, and most importantly, the way in which the political class reacts to rural culture. I'm not the only person who's been looking into this. As I did my research, I found many articles that supported my thesis, and I was able to incorporate a very broad range of expertise into my arguments. I found a study on engaging poor rural parents in their children's educational future. I found many economic journals talking about policy breakdowns and the way it affected rural areas. And I found books talking about the culture of rural areas and the way that they interacted with these policy breakdowns, making them seem almost more impactful. The importance of looking into this question is that, especially in this election year where a Republican has won the popular vote for the first time in recent history, is that the Democratic Party needs to get stronger, and in order to do so, we must look into why voters are leaving us. As someone who's moved from a very urban liberal area to very rural conservative area, I think I have a unique perspective on this, and I can see the differences, and I can really understand what makes people flee from the Democratic Party. The first cause of this distrust that we will examine in this presentation is NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. Signed into law by Bill Clinton, a Democratic president, NAFTA meant many things to many different people. For corporations, it meant that they could start producing things in Mexico for lower wages and lower costs, and they wouldn't have to pay tariffs bringing them back into the United States. This meant that they would make a bigger profit. The thinking here was that money would kind of trickle down, which we've seen doesn't work. What it meant for people living in poor rural areas were that factories shut down and jobs were lost that people had depended on for generations to provide a stable lifestyle. As seen in the argument by Brown and Swanson, they say globalization threatens the rural competitive advantage in low-cost labor and land. Both are considerably less expensive in overseas locations. Now, the government did foresee the land issue and ended up subsidizing many farm products. One of the most subsidized farm products was corn, leading to such an unhealthy diet in the U.S. today. And the people most impacted by this unhealthy diet live in rural areas. This segues us almost perfectly into a discussion about farm policy. There are two different types of farm policy we'll be examining in this slide: right-to-farm laws and farm subsidy laws. We'll start with the farm subsidies as they most directly hinge on NAFTA. Farm subsidies are distributed in a way where large farms often get more than they need and small farms get less than they need. As Gunderson and Offit look to find whether these subsidies work, they say that existing farm programs, which distribute benefits based on volume of commodity produced, provide poor farm households whose farm operations tend to be small, with lower payments than their larger, better-off counterparts. They conclude that contemporary farm safety net does not therefore provide a guarantee against poverty. The other policy we'll be looking at are right-to-farm laws, which are often capitalized upon by CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. It's a very dirty operation. They move into rural areas and use these laws that were intended to protect farmers from developers, to protect themselves from responsibility to the environment and the people living in the area they've moved into. As Ashwood points out, right-to-farm laws have capitalized upon very real divisions and loss. Farmers have indeed gone out of business in droves, and rural areas are often extracted from for urban and global consumption. This just means that as large corporations come into these rural areas, these laws are more easily used by these corporations than by the people they were originally intended to protect. Another factor in the distrust of the Democratic Party by poor rural constituents is the failure of education systems in these rural communities. While rural culture does not support education, there are also spatial issues and policy failures that factor into this problem. Two key social factors have sizable positive effects on achievement. The first are parents who discuss school matters with their child, and the second is parents who have high aspirations with regard to their child attending college. Many social and economic factors make these two things impossible in rural communities. High aspirations for college are not going to come from families facing insecurity, where little to no family members will have gone to college themselves. And talking about school with children isn't going to happen if you're scrapping for food, if you're poor, if you're hungry. You're going to be more likely to send your kid out to chop wood or catch fish than talk about schooling. There are also spatial issues, as seen in the argument made by Gurley. Another factor that intensifies rural poverty is the geographical distance between rural communities and higher education institutions, as well as technical and vocational schools. Similarly, when it comes to providing social support for rural America, spatial challenges arise, making those services accessible and visible to the remote public. The combination of these issues leads to a vicious cycle between the failure of education and the lack of jobs in these areas. The jobs make education harder to get, and the education makes jobs harder to get. Commuting or relocating to decent schools is just not feasible for people in an already strained economic space. While commuting and relocation are often thought of as feasible opportunities to work around the education and job problems in rural areas, they're often not feasible. As seen in the argument by Sherman, mobility is not always economically feasible and is generally not culturally or personally acceptable. Relocating means that you would lose your entire support group. Oftentimes, families have lived in these places for generations, and moving out of these places means you lose a very tight support group and a tight-knit community. As seen in the argument by Brown and Swanson, commuters quite simply have less time for personal, family, and community activities than those who work closer to home. This is along the same lines. If you're commuting, you have less time to engage with your community, which is an important support group to those struggling economically. Another seemingly feasible solution to economic inequality in rural areas is welfare. And while some do turn to welfare in these areas, it is often seen as the tool of the lazy and irresponsible. As Sherman points out, the tendency of the drug addicted to choose welfare and welfare recipients to turn to drugs contribute to the stigma of both activities, further entrenching the cycle. The cycle to which she refers is the phenomenon that in these communities, when those who were on welfare or from welfare families try to get jobs, they're often turned away under the impression that they have a bad work ethic. Another issue surrounding welfare is the policy that we've put forth. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 put in place limits on how long and under what conditions people could be receiving welfare. And it sought to increase moral behavior, work, family values, not having children out of wedlock, and to reduce the cycle of dependency caused by open-ended support. While this act helped many people in urban areas get jobs and turn away from the cycle of being dependent on welfare, it did not work in rural areas. As pointed out by Swaminathan and Findus, a key question for rural areas was whether changes in policy that sought to put poor people on welfare assistance to work was whether this policy change could reduce poverty rates in rural areas due to the weak job prospects there. For rural areas, it appears that the answer to this important question is no. This effect is only found for metro areas. And then in the similar argument by Sherman, she talks about how all the money that we put into welfare reform and welfare itself should be put into job and vocational training and job creation in these areas, as the issue isn't so much that people lack the want, the drive, the work ethic. It's just that they lack job opportunities. This distrust of people on welfare and the shrinking lack of job opportunities in rural areas leads to an increasing frustration with Democrats, as it seems that we leverage taxes from these people in order to support people who don't have the same work ethic that they do. A common question asked when discussing poor rural communities in a liberal area are, why are we focusing on these majority white communities when we should be focusing on communities of color who have a more entrenched and institutionalized history of poverty? In the argument by Brown and Swanson, they point out that although most who live in rural areas are white, poverty rates are higher amongst non-metropolitan blacks, Latinos, and non-whites than their central city counterparts. This reflects a historical legacy that has left rural areas with concentrated minority populations among the nation's most economically depressed locales. The focus on these rural areas is not a focus on white conservatives. This is a focus on the people who truly need our support the most and have been historically overlooked in our public policy as Democrats. According to Gurley, pockets of extreme poverty can be attributed to the lasting effects of an oppressive economic system of slavery and sharecropping that predates the United States and continues to benefit white elites and block opportunity for mobility amongst black and white workers and tenants. Similarly, deeply entrenched pockets of rural poverty in Appalachia, the majority of which are white, can be attributed to a resource extraction economy with a structure that rewards coal industry barons at the expense of workers. The argument here states that despite the differences between people of color and white people living in poverty, the cause is the same: white elites exploiting a working class that's being derisively pitted against one another. This segues us into our conversation about racism. My favorite quote I found on this concerning poor rural areas was from Davidson. The far right didn't create bigotry in the Midwest. It didn't need to. It merely had to tap into the existing undercurrent of prejudice once this had been inflamed by widespread economic failure and social discontent. The argument says that exploitation has long pitted poor whites against poor people of color, creating a racist sentiment that conservatives have a very easy time tapping into and creating a fear-mongered base. If Democrats could work together to help people see that if you're in the exploited class, we all have somebody to work against, and it's not each other, we could get very far. Conservative politicians have a vested interest in keeping this racial divide strong. They are often able to tap into fears and anxieties of rural residents to create a base for policies that wouldn't even support these residents in the first place. In an argument by Davidson, they say that the far right understands rural people's alienation and exploits it, transforming their bitter desperation into political action that suits the right's own broader agenda. In another argument by Sherman, they point out that most residents feel that neither side has much interest in their material well-being and economic sustenance. However, the right-wing agenda, with its focus on moral and personal issues, hits much closer to home. When your hunting rifle is a major source of your ability to engage with your children in a masculine activity, reproduce your unique culture, and provide for your family, gun control will likely seem a serious threat. Similarly, when moral capital is one of your main resources of tradable capital, the agenda that stresses moral issues will be that one that resonates better. These two arguments point out how well the conservative agenda really targets people in rural areas, on fronts that don't really affect them that much, but feel like they do. If Democrats could come to the table with an open understanding of people in these rural areas and a hardline economic issue, we could do much better than we do now, and we should have a vested interest in doing so. According to Gurley, progressives and working-class Americans have many reasons to forge a stronger relationship, specifically in challenging the authority of corporate America and increasing the bargaining power of workers. The culture wars of the 60s and 70s, in conjunction with the advent of identity politics in the 1990s, have served to pit the working and urban poor against each other, and to distract from the very real battle of economic instability and political disenfranchisement that poor Americans of all origins share. The Democratic Party needs to do a better job at embracing this message. While identity and social politics are important, you can't win elections on them. And economic issues are something we regularly don't talk about and don't do a good enough job with. As we move forward into this new era of democratic politics, it is necessary for U.S. policies to work with, not against, the local cultural norms and community strength to support both adaptation to poverty and eventually escape from it. Sherman. Conservatives do a wonderful job with this, and in the Democratic Party, we seem to miss it again and again, and it's starting to really hurt us. It's something we need to do much better on. As pointed out by Davidson, if genuine alternatives are not provided, a significant number of rural ghetto residents, bitter, desperate, and increasingly cut off from the nation's cities, are sure to seek their salvation in the politics of hate. This is a phenomenon that we are already seeing, and in order to combat it, we must reach out to people who disagree with us with open minds and a willingness to understand, an agreement to disagree, and a vision towards the future.